there's explosion of dialysis centers. And what's even alarming is this. With the 10-year change and increase the causes of death in the Philippines, and mainly from hypertensive heart disease, stroke, chronic kidney disease, type 2 diabetes, and Alzheimer's. And we know that there's also cardiovascular association with Alzheimer's and hypertension. So this is the reality now. We have stories like this, like Mrs. Gomez has hypertension and diabetes and suffered a stroke. And two of the family members had to stop working to take care of her so she could cope with the illness and continue back to walking and just facing the activities of daily living. So these are real. And this is a patient with diabetes and who was amputated and undergoing dialysis. And basically, they have to sell their house so he could be dialyzed. Because you can't tell your brother, you say, sorry, you can't be dialyzed, we don't have any money. No, they have to sell their house, and they have to sell their 2 Carabaos, which are actually the sources of their livelihood. So there must be, something that we could do, because all of these are preventable with just a new vision for a diet, exercise program. So we started with actually doing medical missions in the Philippines, and we spent phenomenal amount of money and resources to get 100 people to volunteer in the Philippines and do 1 week of medical mission. We spent $250,000 for what? For 1 week. We don't, there's a nice fulfillment, it is real. The fulfillment is real. It's an eye-opening experience for volunteers who come to the Philippines. But really, the outcome is really, at best, very marginal. So what do we propose to do and stay away from all these Band-Aid approaches? So we propose to do a direct patient-to-doctor relationship and creating a system such as this, the system that has this, and make a connection to the patients and provide all this care with the platform of not only prevention, education, but also research in addition to treatment. And we already established collaboration in the Philippines, so basically for sustainability and scalability. I'm out of time. This is the end goal.
So I'd like to introduce Dr. Paul Wong, again, mentor of mine, Asian role model for 20 years. I can't believe it's been so long. Please.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity. This is really exciting, Latha and Brian, to be here. So I'm one of several cardiologists who are here today, and obviously want to talk to you about the importance of cardiovascular disease in Asians. So I'm a professor of medicine. I direct the Arrhythmia Center, so what that means, heart rhythm problems. And I'll tell you about some of the other roles too. So Latha kind of touched upon this. One of the important things that when we deal with different ethnicities is really how you metabolize medications. As you all know, one of our biggest, as healthcare providers, one of the biggest things we can do is to provide the appropriate medicine in the appropriate dose. And so metabolism that we all use to process these medications that are really important to survival and better health is determined by your genetics in great part. And this is being studied greatly now. There's a whole range of efforts. I've illustrated one example here, an old medication, one that's been around for decades now, called warfarin or Coumadin, for stroke prevention and atrial fibrillation, something very dear to my heart in terms of really making quality of life better and preventing stroke. And so what we've learned now is that there's lots about the genetics in particular, in East Asians in particular, but all Asians have a high propensity of these certain genetic alleles or traits that makes metabolism different than other individuals. So very important to consider. Actually, I thought we took that out, but that's fine. So that's fine. We'll talk about this later. So one of the things we're interested in is looking at atrial fibrillation and this, one of the very common alleles. Particularly in Han Chinese, it's up to 50 to 70% of Han Chinese have this, and it basically results in when you socially drink, you flush. So some of my colleagues, Raj is going to talk about biodesign. I'm called a faculty liaison, involved in the biodesign faculty fellowship program. So we're very interested in getting people involved in that, and particularly looking at problems in Asia. And finally, with Bryant Lin, other associates, Ying Liu, Randy Stafford, my co-PI, and Ken Mahaffey, we just received a $5 million grant to look at something really important. That is, why do patients, in fact, accept anticoagulation for stroke prevention? So we definitely want to recruit patients who are Asians. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So next up is Raj Doshi, so entrepreneur extraordinaire and director of the Biodesign India program.
Hi everyone, Raj Doshi from the Biodesign program, as Brian mentioned. And today I'm going to talk about the work that we've been doing in India since the year 2007. So biodesign is basically application of design thinking to medical technology innovation. So basically applying this to healthcare to look for problems which we then solve. There's really three parts of our process. It starts with identifying problems, so actually spending a lot of time to understand what are the problems in a certain geography. It's followed by inventing a solution, and then ultimately implementation, or creating a solution which is broadly applicable for actually making that broadly available for people. So in 2007, we were approached by the Indian government to take a program that was really developed for the US audience and adjust that for the needs of India, right? The key need in India was that given the mass burden of disease, there needed to be new technologies that were developed for Indian needs that were relevant to that population. So we started a fellowship program. This fellowship program hosted 4 fellows per year, all Indian nationals. They would come to Stanford for 6 months. They would learn our biodesign process. Then they would go back to India for the second part of the fellowship, back to Delhi to our sister institutions, the All India Institute of Medical Sciences and IIT Delhi, and then go use our processes to understand local needs and then create solutions in the form of medical devices. So through this 8-year or 9-year process, we trained 32 fellows, helped create 24 devices, and started 12 companies, true to the spirit of the Bay Area. Okay, so, and I'll share what some of those devices are, but during our second phase of our program, which started just last year, we basically we did another need assessment, and we recognized that these new companies that were being started in India were having a very difficult time developing product and ultimately commercializing them. And one of the major issues that we found was how these companies interface with the Indian government, and how could the Indian government really implement these really life-changing solutions. Turns out that the government has very strict processes that are very difficult to navigate for small companies. So we've sort of focused this new program called Founders Forum on helping these small companies here in the smaller circle navigate this commercialization and scaling process in India. And we work within a larger ecosystem of government, government groups and NGOs and medical device companies, all with the focus of creating products that are relevant and really life-saving for the Indian population. And last slide, just want to share some of the types of devices that we work on. The device on the left is a low-cost ophthalmology screening device, which is now broadly used across several states across India. In this case, you can see that it's being used to screen for preventable blindness in a rural, poor population. In the middle, you can see up top, you can see a neonatal hearing screening device, which is not generally done in India, but if you can identify hearing screening loss at a young age, then you can actually help these children hear and ultimately speak as well. There's a phototherapy device for neonatal jaundice, which is very common in India. And finally, there's a neonatal hypothermia detection device, which is used to basically assess the temperature of newborns when they go home to rural settings. So if you'd like to learn more about biodesign in India, come talk to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If anybody has any questions or wants to contact the speakers, we'd be happy to connect them later. So next up is Juha Huang, senior faculty in gastroenterology, and amazingly was recruited here from UW despite the expensive house prices.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Latha, for this invitation. It's an honor to be here, and it's great to be here at Stanford. The population that you demonstrated here is one of the reasons I decided to move down here. It's similar to Seattle, so I could continue my work on gastric cancer. So as you mentioned, I'm a professor in the Division of Gastroenterology and Hepatology, and I'm really passionate about gastric cancer and screening here in the U.S., partly because I'm one of those people who are affected, as many of you in the room are. To give some background, esophageal cancer is not as prevalent as gastric cancer in the United States. So there's only about 17,000 cases of esophageal cancer and over 28,000 cases of gastric cancer in the US, but we have screening guidelines for esophageal cancer because that affects mainly obese white men, right? Gastric cancer is much more prevalent, but it's mainly Asians and Hispanics that get gastric cancer. So it's the immigrant minority that is affected to a larger extent by gastric cancer, but we have no screening guidelines in the United States for gastric cancer, and we need them. To put this in perspective by race, the background race of the US, which is mainly white, 6.9 per 100,000, so really low incidence. But if you look at African Americans, it doubles to 12. If you lump all Asians together, it's not that impressive, 13. So again, perfect example of we can't be lumpers when we come to this. If you look at Japanese Americans, it goes up to 24.2, and then Korean Americans, that's me, 52.2. So to give you some perspective, we start colon cancer screening. We think that cost-effective colon cancer screening occurs at about 50 per 100,000, and that's for a more expensive test, right? So it really is a no-brainer when it comes to this, but the politicians aren't listening, and we need our healthcare to reflect that. And so the American Society of Gastroenterology has guidelines that no one really listens to, and they suggest screening EGD for gastric cancer in new U.S. immigrants from high-risk regions such as Korea, Japan, and China. And Korea, Japan, and China worldwide accounts for 60% of gastric cancer. And gastric cancer is number 3 cause of cancer deaths in the U.S. So big problem. But we have a tendency to ignore this. And so our mission here, I'm working with Rob Huang, who's a new faculty member who just joined us after completing his fellowship. And we're working on looking at screening guidelines, what are additional risk factors. But the key points are that East Asians, particularly Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese, and patients with family histories are the highest risk. And so we really should consider screening EGDs. Screening programs in Japan and Korea have already demonstrated survival benefits. So there's actually plenty of data in this area. And then the problem is there's no current screening recommendations in the US. And the reason we need these screening recommendations is that we need insurance to cover this at no cost. And so that's what we're working on here, and I hope to continue this work here at Stanford. So thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Letta, and thanks, Bryant. It's my pleasure to be here today to tell you a little bit about the Stanford South Asian Translational Heart Initiative, and specifically the CardioClick program. So this is a research initiative that we launched a little while ago. It is a multidisciplinary telehealth approach to managing cardiovascular risk in our high-risk South Asian population. So very briefly, many of you in this room probably know, but South Asians are disproportionately affected by heart disease.